Welcome to this introduction about comics and how they work. For most of us, when we think about comics, we connect this with a young reader, probably a child, or we might think of a childish adult. Part of the issue facing comics here is that the child reader graduates from pictures to block text. That's the reader development that we all went through. So reading anything with pictures after that might feel regressive. But here's the thing. Much like fairy tales, the association of comics with childhood is an accident of our domestic history, and only seeing comics in this light can cause us to ignore a rich resource of literature. So what makes comics a viable and engaging form for writing? Scott McCloud puts this brilliantly in his book, Understanding Comics. He points out that when we see two dots and a line, our brains tell us that it's a face. But he goes on to argue that the amazing thing here isn't that we see a face, but that we cannot help but see a face. Our brains won't let us see anything else. This begs the question, why? Why would anyone respond to a cartoon as much or more than a realistic image? Here's a suggestion. Comics tend to be more abstract representations of reality. And what happens when we abstract a face? We tie into something that our minds are doing all the time anyway. We can't always see our own faces, but we do have an abstract awareness of them. We are aware of ourselves as abstractions. So when we see an abstracted face, like two dots and a line, more people can identify with it and project themselves into it. So what is a comic? Scott McCloud defines comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, intended to convey information and/or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. In this session, we will focus on getting some key ideas under our belts before developing ideas ourselves. So let's have a quick look at some of the elements that are contained within comics and graphic novels. Number 1. Panelling. Panels are also referred to as frames. These are the boxes that we see the action contained within. Your brains are marvellous things. Without your even noticing, you have absorbed a wide vocabulary for connecting ideas into meaningful narratives. For example, let's take a look at Figure 1. Who taught you to connect these ideas into something meaningful, whereby one image is related to the other? This is a learnt skill, and it begins with learning to read. We connect ideas based on our understanding of narrative and our experiences. We connect to characters and their dilemmas because we recognise the situations from our own experience. I have experienced my phone ringing, so when I see panel 1, 3 and 5, I fill in the information relating to it. You do this too. We all see and experience more than is actually present in these panels. What's more, in the space between panels, we connect the ideas of 1, a phone ringing, and 2, someone calling another person together so that they are related. We also experience the passage of time as the character making the call becomes even more tense. This story could go two ways right now. It could fulfill your expectations, and it turns out that these two ideas are connected. Or it could thwart your expectations, and maybe these ideas aren't connected at all. The panels or frames do a number of things in terms of setting up each image and therefore each section that we are reading at any one time. But it is the space in between the panels where your brain is connecting the dots. This is referred to as ellipsis in film, and Scott McCloud calls it closure when referring to comics. This also applies to the way our brains fill in the gaps within each frame. For instance, to return to Figure 1, you cannot see the body and legs of the character in the second panel, but you have mentally accepted that they exist in order to buy into the world and invest in the story. Much of writing comics is not so much about what you say and what you draw, as about what you do not say or draw. Comics allow their creator to focus on specific details and to highlight these, as they are important to the idea that is being expressed. So, do comics have to have panels? Well, they are extremely helpful, and it is important to understand how they work and how they enable the reader to make sense of the story, but we do not have to use them. For a good example of this, we can see Marjane Satrapi's book, Embroideries. Satrapi does not use panels in this book. However, there are some implicit divides between actions that are given through the space on the page, This makes for a story that flows freely from one idea to the next, and it gives a sense of uncontained ideas, which particularly resonates with the subject and setting of this comic. So, in all writing, think, what do I want to say, and what is the best way to say this? Number 2, symbols in comics. These include the speech bubble, the thought bubble, speed lines, smells, smoke, and breath. And these recognisable symbols have developed over time. Japanese comics developed their own symbols as they were isolated for so long from the rest of the world. Number 3, a character's mental and emotional state. This can be conveyed in a number of ways. It can be understated and then only seen through the character's actions, as in the violent eruption in Adrian Tomein's story, Dine and Dash. This is classic storytelling through showing rather than telling. The main character does not say, "I'm so angry." He shows us this through his actions. On the other hand, emotional and physical states are shown very figuratively by the French writer and artist David B. in his comic Epileptic. Backgrounds can also be employed to portray emotional truth, as indeed can panels. And this is where we get to an important point in the making of comics. All of this is symbol. Even the poses that your characters strike is symbolic of rest, activity, sadness, happiness. Comics can only work because people will not only interpret the symbols, but they will identify with them. Alternatively, backgrounds can also often be drawn in highly realistic and artistic ways in order to try and convince the reader of their authenticity, like this panel from the book Mesolith. Comics are a wonderfully expressive medium to employ, and that's why they can resonate so strongly with readers. One of the reasons that a reader might resonate so strongly with a comic is that the more symbolic the characterization, the easier it is to identify with it. So when you are scripting your comic, you need to think about how a person reads a comic. Pacing, while if it's done correctly the reader will not even notice it, is an integral part of the story, determining the intellectual pace at which the reader will move through the story and the timing of events within the story for greatest impact. To understand comic book pacing, try to work out how long the reader will spend looking at a panel before moving on to the next slide. First, they will spend time reading the captions and dialogue balloons. A panel that contains the standard 35 words will take 7 to 8 seconds to read, depending on the complexity of the accompanying image. Read a comic with pacing in mind, and you begin to get a sense for how long a reader will spend on each panel. A pensive or thoughtful scene should have slow pacing. A fight scene or heavy action panel should be quick. A fight scene or something that needs to move quickly is marred by captions and dialogue balloons. Dialogue, though, does not necessarily result in a slow scene. You might have a slow-paced scene without any dialogue or writing, which is slow because of the way panelling has been employed, or because of the increased level of detail in the drawing, like this page from Julie Duché. Of course, you can introduce elements that actually disrupt the flow of your story and use these to good effect. The only limit to storytelling is your imagination. Thanks for listening.